Tonight, we're going to explore something that sounds simple, but is actually one of the most powerful forces in history: ancient climate shifts. You've probably heard about droughts, floods, or ice ages before. Scientists and historians talk about them often when explaining why civilizations rose or fell. But here's what most people don't realize. When you truly understand how climate changed the world in the past, when you begin to grasp the scale of its impact, it changes how you see human history. This is not just about weather or seasons. It's about forces so vast that they shaped entire societies, economies, and cultures, often in ways we are still discovering today. And by the end of this journey, you're going to understand exactly why these ancient shifts mattered, and why they can teach us lessons about our own world. Before we go any further, if you enjoy slow, deep explorations like this, a quick like or subscribe really helps the channel grow. It's a small thing for you, but it makes a huge difference for me. Now, let's begin. Long before humans began to build cities or sow seeds, the earth moved through a quiet rhythm of cold and warmth, a slow pulse that shaped the very foundation of life. Ice spread and retreated across continents, leaving behind layers of frozen ground that would hold secrets for tens of thousands of years. In the far north and south, glaciers extended their reach, grinding rock beneath and pressing down on the land with immense weight. In places that would later become homes and fields, tundra stretched under pale sunlight, and rivers carved deep channels through soils hardened by frost. The sky often carried the scent of snow, of wind-driven ice, and the faint, clean smell of water frozen and melting, and life moved in response to these changes. Scientists today look back through time by reading ice cores, long cylinders drilled from the thickest sheets of ice. These cores reveal trapped air from millennia past. Each layer tells a story of temperature, of greenhouse gases, of particles that drifted through the atmosphere. Some layers hold evidence of dust storms, volcanic ash, and pollen from long extinct plants. These small records show that climate was never static. It shifted gradually, sometimes more abruptly, forcing living beings to adapt or move. In the deep ice, bubbles of ancient air capture carbon dioxide levels, hinting at the tension between warmth and cold, between ice and water, that has always shaped the possibilities for life. In those frozen landscapes, the rhythm of seasons controlled every step of survival. Rivers that later became central to human civilizations were often temporary, swollen by meltwater in spring and diminished in winter. Forests pushed forward during warmer times and retreated during colder periods, leaving gaps where grasslands expanded. Animals followed these shifts, migrating with the movement of food and shelter. Early humans, moving across these shifting worlds, learned to read the sky and the snow, the thickness of ice, the flow of rivers, and the scents carried on the wind. They knew that subtle changes in temperature or rainfall could mean the difference between a plentiful season and scarcity. Sediments at the bottom of lakes and seas preserve a quiet record of this rhythm. Layers of clay, silt, and organic matter settle slowly, each year recording rainfall, wind, and plant growth. Fossils of tiny organisms, microscopic shells, and pollen reveal which plants dominated a landscape, and in turn, which animals roamed there. Scientists can reconstruct temperature changes from isotopes in these materials, seeing patterns of warmth and cold, of wet and dry periods. Each layer is a whisper from the past, a way to understand the slow unfolding of the Earth's systems long before human observation shaped knowledge. The movement of tectonic plates and the formation of mountains affected climate even before humans had learned to farm or settle. High ranges captured clouds and produced rainfall, feeding rivers that carved valleys below. Mountains created rain shadows, where one side remained wet and green and the other dry and barren. These natural patterns influenced where plants grew and where animals could survive. Glaciers flowing from these heights scraped valleys clean, leaving behind moraines and sediment that would later provide fertile ground for human use. Even before humans understood the causes, the Earth's surface itself was directing the rhythms of life. Volcanic activity sometimes punctuated the slow rhythms of climate. Eruptions spewed ash high into the atmosphere, sometimes for months or years. The dust could reflect sunlight and cool the land, while the ash falling to the ground altered soils and water. Fossil records show periods of stunted plant growth following major eruptions, and evidence in ice cores and sediments reveals sudden drops in temperature. These events, though infrequent compared to the long glacial cycles, had immediate consequences for ecosystems, reshaping landscapes and challenging species to adapt. The oceans carried heat and moisture around the globe. Currents flowed like invisible rivers beneath the surface, moving warm water from the equator toward the poles and cold water back again. The patterns of these currents influenced rainfall, storm formation, and regional climates. When ocean temperatures shifted, monsoon rains in some regions became stronger or weaker, and deserts expanded or contracted. Even small variations in these systems could ripple outward, affecting distant lands in subtle but profound ways. Ice ages slowed ocean currents, while warmer periods revived them, linking polar and tropical climates in a vast, interconnected network. Glacial cycles themselves were tied to tiny shifts in Earth's orbit, subtle changes in tilt and wobble that altered the distribution of sunlight. These changes, called Milankovitch cycles, acted over tens of thousands of years, pushing the Earth into ice ages or warm periods. During glacial maxima, ice covered much of North America, Europe, and Asia, while lower sea levels exposed land bridges and new migration routes. During interglacial periods, ice receded, rivers swelled, forests spread, and the climate became more hospitable to life. These cycles provided a framework within which ecosystems evolved and humans slowly learned to survive. Within this shifting environment, early humans were constrained by climate, yet they also learned to exploit its rhythms. They followed herds across open tundra, harvested plants when seasons allowed, and settled temporarily where water and food were reliable. Tools and fire extended their abilities to survive cold winters or hunt in sparse landscapes. Seasonal knowledge, when snow melted, when rivers swelled, when berries ripened, was passed down over generations. Climate was not a distant abstraction. It was a daily presence that shaped movement, behavior, and survival strategies. By studying these earliest climates, scientists begin to see patterns that would later influence civilizations. The stability of temperature and rainfall determined where crops could grow, where settlements could endure, and where populations could flourish. Variations in climate could push entire species, including humans, to innovate, migrate, or perish. The evidence preserved in ice, sediment, rock, and fossil offers a window into this ancient world. A slow and deliberate story of an Earth in motion, a stage upon which all later human history would unfold. The planet's past is embedded in its surfaces, its waters, and its frozen heights, waiting for careful observation to reveal the rhythms that shaped life long before cities, empires, or written records came to exist. As glaciers receded and the planet warmed into the Holocene, the Earth offered a new kind of stability that would encourage humans to linger in one place. Seasons became more predictable, and rivers flowed with a regularity that had not existed during the unpredictable cold of the previous ice age. Valleys filled with silt and floodplains expanded, creating patches of soil rich enough to support sustained plant growth. In these areas, the earliest seeds of agriculture took root, quite literally. Small communities began to settle near streams and lakes, watching the land respond to seasonal sun, rainfall, and meltwater. The rhythm of the environment became a guide. People could feel the turn of the seasons in the wind, smell the dampness in the soil, hear the rise of water in channels that swelled each spring. Each sensory signal provided a cue for planting, harvesting, or moving temporarily to follow game. This period is known as the Neolithic Revolution, a slow but profound transformation. Humans shifted from hunting and gathering to cultivating plants and managing animals. Wheat and barley in the Fertile Crescent grew where winter rains fed the soil, and the length of warm days allowed kernels to mature. In Asia, early rice paddies depended on predictable monsoon patterns, and maize in the Americas required careful observation of rainfall and frost cycles. Crop success was never guaranteed. Archaeobotanical records show fluctuations in pollen and seeds that reflect periods of drought or unusually wet seasons. In some centuries, layers of charred grains indicate fields destroyed by fire or sudden floods, while other layers reveal abundant harvests when climate aligned favorably. Humans quickly learned that their fates were tied to these subtle changes, that patience, observation, and timing were as important as the act of sowing itself. Early farmers responded to their environment with simple but effective tools. Terraces were cut into hillsides to slow water and capture soil. Channels guided river water to fields, and rudimentary irrigation systems appeared to bring water to crops when rainfall faltered. These adaptations were not universal, but arose where climate pressures demanded them. In arid zones, communities became skilled at conserving water, digging wells and reservoirs, storing rain in pits lined with clay. In regions where soil was fertile but flood-prone, embankments held water back, and planting cycles were adjusted to avoid the worst seasonal inundations. The landscape itself was transformed by human hands, yet always in conversation with the rhythms of climate. Stones moved, channels dug, seeds scattered, all in response to the unseen patterns of weather and water. Evidence of these early agricultural strategies appears in sediment layers and pollen records. Scientists can detect the spread of domesticated grains by the increase of certain pollen types in lakes and wetlands near human settlements. Charcoal fragments hint at land clearing, while shifts in isotopes reveal periods when humans relied heavily on cultivated plants rather than wild foraging. Analysis of soil layers shows repeated cycles of enrichment and erosion, reflecting both successful farming and the strain placed on the land by repeated planting. Each observation connects directly to climate. Wet seasons could replenish nutrients and expand fields, while droughts left terraces dry and cracked, forcing communities to ration food and move carefully through their territory. Rivers became central to life. The Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Yellow River, and the Indus provided more than water. They shaped landscapes and dictated where settlements could survive. Seasonal flooding left behind rich sediments, replenishing soil. But too much water or too little could devastate crops. Communities developed detailed knowledge of these patterns, measuring the height of river marks, observing rainfall upstream, and sensing changes in soil moisture through touch and smell. Winds carried scents of damp or drying earth, signaling the approach of a dry season or the promise of rain. The sound of water moving over stones or across shallow channels informed when to plant or harvest, when to repair levees or redirect flow. These senses, trained over generations, were essential tools for early farmers in their delicate balance with climate. In addition to the major cereals, humans cultivated legumes, tubers, and other staples that responded differently to climate. Beans and peas offered protein and could fix nitrogen, helping poor soils recover. Tubers, grown in regions with less predictable rainfall, stored calories underground, safe from surface heat and drought. Observing how different crops responded to sun, rain, and frost taught humans to diversify. Fields were mixed, sometimes interspersing crops with wild plants, hedges, or trees that moderated soil temperature and moisture. The selection of crop varieties reflected both environment and human ingenuity. Climate shaped which seeds were chosen, which terraces built, and which fields abandoned when conditions turned harsh. Even small fluctuations in climate could ripple through these early agricultural systems. 1 year of below-average rainfall could reduce yields, while several years of excessive rain could cause pests or rot. Archaeological sites show storage pits filled in anticipation of lean seasons, granaries elevated above flood levels, and evidence of trade to supplement local scarcity. These responses indicate an awareness of climate cycles, even without a written language or formal scientific understanding. Knowledge was passed orally, encoded in rituals, observation, and shared labor, linking human survival directly to environmental patterns. The smells of wet soil after spring rains, the cool touch of damp clay underfoot, the sound of water sluicing through channels, all became embedded in cultural memory as signals for action. Soil itself told stories. Thick, dark layers indicated years of cultivation with organic matter replenished, while pale or eroded layers reflected overuse, drought, or flood. Observations of soil texture, moisture, and even temperature guided the timing of planting and harvesting. Communities developed a sense of the land as a living system that responded slowly to human action, but quickly to climate. Small changes, a late frost, an unusually wet winter, could ripple through crops and affect food security. Farmers monitored plants closely, noting changes in leaf color, growth rate, and seed development. These details allowed them to anticipate stress and respond with techniques that mitigated losses, whether through irrigation, crop rotation, or selective planting. Across continents, the pattern was similar. Climate dictated the possibilities of agriculture. From the Fertile Crescent to East Asia, from the Nile Valley to the Americas, stable climate windows allowed farming to flourish. Humans adapted, experimented, and innovated, always attuned to the quiet signals of the environment. The relationship between people and land was intimate. It was sensory, practical, and continuous. Seasons became markers not just of time, but of action. Rivers, wind, soil, and sky were instruments in an ongoing dialogue, guiding planting and harvest, shaping diets, settlements, and culture. In this way, the Neolithic Revolution was inseparable from climate. Without the long periods of stability that followed the Ice Age, the cultivation of wheat, barley, rice, and maize might not have been possible, and the foundations of civilization would have been delayed or reshaped. Human settlement patterns mirrored environmental opportunities. Villages clustered where fertile soil and reliable water met, often near river confluences or floodplains. The layout of fields, paths, and homes responded to microclimates within the landscape. Slight hills provided drainage, low areas collected water, and sun-facing slopes warmed early in spring. Early engineers diverted water carefully, using gravity to guide flow, while windbreaks and sheltering trees mitigated extreme conditions. These adaptations were subtle but necessary. They represent the first conscious manipulation of landscape in response to climate, a practice that would expand and evolve as societies grew. Across time, the dialogue between humans and climate became more complex. Observation-informed planting calendars and patterns of rainfall and frost guided migration decisions within a region. Communities learned to read cloud shapes, wind directions, and bird migrations as signals for imminent weather changes. Seasonal smells and sounds from damp earth to the gurgle of newly flowing channels offered immediate information. In this early period, survival depended on attentiveness, and attention shaped knowledge. Every small adaptation, every observed signal, strengthened the connection between climate and human development. Without this deep sensitivity, agriculture could not have spread, and the foundation of complex societies would have remained out of reach. Archaeological and environmental evidence together tells a vivid story of this time. Layers of sediment, pollen analysis, and plant remains illustrate how humans responded to variability in rainfall and temperature. Terraces and irrigation ditches mark conscious intervention in the landscape. Tools for harvesting and storing grains indicate the importance of timing and care. Each artifact is part of a larger picture. Humans actively managing their environment while climate guided the possibilities. The interplay of human ingenuity and environmental constraint created the earliest lessons in adaptation, resilience, and resource management, lessons that would echo in every subsequent civilization. By the end of this early agricultural period, humans had developed a nuanced understanding of climate without measuring instruments or thermometers. They knew that stability was essential for sustained planting, that rivers and soils responded to seasonal patterns, and that crops could fail or flourish depending on subtle variations. They observed the sky, soil, and water, learning to anticipate change and respond to it. This close observation, passed across generations, set the stage for larger societal structures that could endure the uncertainties of climate. Without these foundations, the rise of villages, towns, and eventually cities would have faced far greater obstacles. Agriculture and climate were inseparable, a partnership that quietly but decisively shaped the course of human history. As farming became more reliable, small villages slowly grew into the first cities. In Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates, the fertile land drew people into concentrated settlements. Fields stretched across floodplains, and canals carried water to crops, transforming the landscape into an intricate network of irrigation. Yet the success of these early civilizations was never guaranteed. The rivers, so vital to life, were subject to seasonal and long-term changes in rainfall. Tree ring and sediment evidence shows that the Uhe region experienced droughts that lasted for years, periods when the soil dried, the canals shrank, and the earth cracked beneath the sun. Early farmers and administrators had to adjust constantly, building new channels, rationing water, and storing grain in anticipation of lean times. Egypt developed alongside the Nile, another river whose flow governed the life of the land. Each year, floods deposited silt, replenishing soils and allowing wheat and barley to grow. But paleoclimate studies reveal that some centuries brought unusually low inundations, with rivers barely spilling over their banks. The fields remained parched, and granaries emptied quickly. Archaeologists have found records in hieroglyphs describing failed harvests, and depictions in tombs show empty granaries and stressed communities. The Egyptians learned to rely on careful observation of seasonal shifts, on reading the clouds and monitoring river levels, and on constructing reservoirs and canals to buffer against variability. These adjustments allowed society to endure, though vulnerability to drought remained a persistent threat. Farther east, the Indus Valley civilizations emerged around the fertile plains of modern-day Pakistan and northwest India. Cities such as Mohenjo-daro and Harappa were laid out with streets, wells, and drainage systems. Water management was sophisticated, yet sediment layers reveal periods of aridity that challenge crops and urban populations alike. Pollen analysis indicates that staple grains struggled during prolonged dry periods, suggesting that climate stress directly influenced food security. River channels shifted, sometimes leaving settlements distant from water sources. Archaeologists see evidence of relocation, of cities abandoned and rebuilt elsewhere, and of granaries and storage systems designed to withstand uncertainty. Early inhabitants of these regions faced the same challenge seen elsewhere. Human ingenuity could buffer against drought, but it could not remove the risks imposed by climate. Across these civilizations, societies responded in multiple ways. Irrigation networks expanded to reach more distant fields, canals and levees were reinforced, and reservoirs held water for dry periods. Trade became a crucial strategy. Surplus grain was exchanged for goods from wetter regions or for materials necessary to repair infrastructure. When conditions deteriorated beyond local management, migration became an option, sometimes temporary, sometimes permanent. Archaeological layers often show abrupt shifts in settlement patterns, reflecting the movement of populations in response to environmental stress. In some cases, the inability to adapt led to collapse, leaving cities empty or partially abandoned, a silent record of climate's power. Historical documents provide a window into these responses. Cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia detail grain distributions, taxes, and resource allocation in years of drought. Hieroglyphic inscriptions in Egypt record the challenges posed by low Nile floods and the administrative measures taken to secure food and water. Seals and clay tokens show evidence of trade and rationing systems designed to sustain populations under stress. These records indicate a conscious awareness of the link between environmental conditions and human survival. Administration and governance became tools not only of order but of survival, adjusting policies, collecting and distributing resources, and planning for the unpredictability of climate. The sensory world of these early cities reflected the pressures of drought. Riverbeds sometimes ran shallow or dry, exposing stones and silt that had been submerged. Fields cracked under the relentless sun, releasing a dry, earthy scent. Dust swirled across streets and open markets, coating homes and storage pits. Winds carried the heat and dryness from desert margins, shifting sand into canals and clogging irrigation channels. In these conditions, human labor was constant, digging, clearing, repairing, and moving water where it was needed. The environment was never passive. It was active, forcing responses at every level, from farmers tending fields to rulers, organizing resources for entire regions. Tree rings, sediment cores, and lake beds provide precise reconstructions of these ancient droughts. Rings show years of reduced growth in trees, indicating dry summers or limited water. Layers of sediment in lakes and floodplains reflect low water levels, revealing the timing and duration of arid periods. Pollen records show the decline of cultivated grains and an increase in hardy, drought-tolerant plants. By combining these natural archives with human records, scientists can match environmental stress to societal change, illustrating how tightly civilization was tied to climate. In Mesopotamia, one prolonged drought likely contributed to the decline of cities in the Akkadian period. Archaeologists note abandoned towns, diminished urban construction, and shifts in trade networks during these dry decades. Similarly, in Egypt, the Old Kingdom experienced stress linked to low Nile floods, with evidence of administrative reform, temple construction slowing, and populations moving closer to water sources. In the Indus Valley, the drying of rivers forced changes in urban planning, the reduction of large-scale public works, and ultimately, in some cases, the abandonment of cities. These patterns are not isolated. They repeat across regions and eras, showing a clear connection between climate stress and societal outcomes. The human response was both practical and cultural. Religious and ceremonial practices often reflected the need for favorable weather, with offerings, rituals, and temple constructions intended to ensure rainfall or river floods. Knowledge of climate cycles became encoded in calendars and agricultural guides. Observations of clouds, river behavior, soil moisture, and the health of plants and animals informed decisions about planting, harvesting, and storage. Communities became attuned to subtle changes, the tone of river water, the smell of the soil after early rains, the patterns of wind and cloud. These sensory cues were as vital as physical structures, forming a complex system of awareness that allowed societies to persist despite environmental uncertainty. Even the most well-organized societies were vulnerable to extremes. When droughts persisted beyond the capacity of irrigation or storage systems, famine became likely. Granaries emptied, and trade alone could not compensate for local scarcity. Evidence shows migrations into more favorable areas, often leading to tensions with neighboring communities or the abandonment of entire settlements. Sediment and pollen records from lakes indicate reduced agriculture, soil degradation, and the re-emergence of wild vegetation in previously cultivated areas. Each cycle of stress and response left an imprint on the landscape, visible, centuries later, in layers of soil, ruins, and fossilized seeds. In Mesopotamia, canals sometimes overflowed when irregular rains arrived after dry years, depositing layers of sediment over previously cultivated land. Farmers had to clear channels, repair banks, and monitor water flow closely, understanding that small delays could ruin crops. In Egypt, even a few inches less water from the Nile could drastically reduce wheat yields, prompting governors to redistribute grain, ration food, and record shortfalls meticulously. In the Indus Valley, shifting river courses could leave entire neighborhoods without reliable water, forcing residents to dig wells or abandon sections of the city. These challenges illustrate the constant negotiation between human settlement and the natural environment, a negotiation framed by climate patterns. Dust storms carried a tangible reminder of dryness. Fine particles lifted from parched plains entered homes, markets, and storage facilities, contaminating grain and creating work for those who maintained irrigation systems. Wind-blown silt changed the color of the sky, muted sunlight, and signaled the approach of severe aridity. In winter, dry, cold winds compounded the effects of low water, chilling both fields and homes. This sensory environment, the cracked earth, the dust-laden winds, the shallow rivers, was inseparable from the political, economic, and cultural structures that arose to manage survival. By examining tree rings, sediment layers, and pollen records alongside written records, modern scientists reconstruct the timing, duration, and severity of these droughts. Patterns emerge across continents. When rainfall declined, food production suffered. When rivers shifted, settlements adapted. The correspondence between climate stress and human action is direct and observable. Irrigation canals, storage granaries, trade networks, migration routes, and ceremonial practices all testify to a society deeply aware of the constraints imposed by environment and the need for coordinated responses. These patterns repeat in subtle ways. Not every drought led to collapse, but every drought tested the resilience of human systems. Communities that managed water carefully, diversified crops, and monitored environmental signals fared better than those that did not. The sensory experience, sensing the drying soil, listening to the river, observing wind patterns, noting plant growth, was as critical to survival as physical infrastructure. Civilization in these early river valleys depended on the integration of observation, labor, and adaptive planning, all guided by climate. Across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, drought events left layered evidence: dry riverbeds, eroded floodplains, charred fields, and abandoned settlements. Yet human ingenuity persisted. Canal systems were extended, reservoirs built, and administrative oversight intensified. Trade networks allowed the movement of grain and other essential goods, mitigating some local shortages. When migration became necessary, it often reshaped political and cultural landscapes, creating new interactions between communities. Each drought, while a challenge, became a catalyst for technological innovation, social organization, and environmental awareness. The story of these civilizations is inseparable from the story of their climate, with dry years and failing rivers marking turning points in human history, recorded in both the earth and the documents humans left behind. Even as societies learned to manage the slow shifts of rainfall and river levels, the earth could produce sudden shocks that left no warning. Volcanic eruptions were among the most dramatic of these events. When a large volcano erupted, it could release vast clouds of ash and gases into the atmosphere, carrying fine particles that circled the globe. Sunlight dimmed as the sky became filled with suspended material, reducing temperatures for months or even years. Crops that depended on warmth and sunlight failed. Rivers and streams cooled, and the rhythm of the seasons changed abruptly. Communities that had grown confident in their observation of seasonal patterns suddenly faced a world that no longer followed its familiar rules. Ice cores reveal these disruptions in remarkable detail. Layers of volcanic ash, sometimes millimeters thick, are trapped within centuries of frozen snowfall. Scientists can detect the sudden injection of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, which forms aerosols that reflect sunlight. Tree rings provide complementary evidence. During the years following major eruptions, growth slows dramatically, producing narrow rings that mark cold, short growing seasons. These natural records allow modern researchers to connect events across continents. A single eruption could cool regions far from its origin, affecting harvests, water supply, and human health thousands of kilometers away. The eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 serves as a dramatic example. The event injected millions of tons of ash and gas into the stratosphere, producing the year without a summer in 1816. Crops failed in Europe and North America. Frost appeared in months when warmth was expected, and lakes froze in some regions long after spring arrived. While this event occurred long after the rise of early civilizations, similar eruptions in antiquity would have had comparable effects on pre-industrial societies. Volcanic aerosols lowered global temperatures, shortened growing seasons, and created sudden food shortages. Contemporary accounts from Tambora describe grey skies, muted sunlight, and cold that lingered in days meant to be warm. Ancient communities would have experienced similar shocks, though without written records to describe them in detail. Historic eruptions left evidence in both natural archives and human settlements. Ash layers in lake sediments mark periods when soil fertility and water availability were disrupted. Pollen analysis often shows a sharp decline in cultivated species, replaced by hardy wild plants that could survive cooler, drier conditions. In some regions, layers of charcoal suggest that humans burned debris or cleared fields in response to environmental disruption. Tree rings show years of stunted growth, recording the abrupt climatic cooling that followed volcanic events. These data reveal that even short-term eruptions could cascade through ecosystems and human systems, producing famine, migration, and social tension. The effects on human societies were immediate and visible. Crops failed, animals suffered, and stored grain became insufficient. Water systems cooled or froze, rivers slowed, and soil productivity declined. Communities had to respond quickly to protect their people and food supplies. In some cases, leaders redistributed grain or opened storehouses, while in others, populations migrated in search of more favorable conditions. Disease often spread more rapidly during these periods, as malnutrition weakened immune systems and crowded living conditions facilitated infection. Social stress increased, and tension could rise between neighboring communities competing for limited resources. Observational skills became critical during volcanic events. People learned to read subtle changes in the sky, noting the reddish or muted light of ash-laden air. The smell of sulfur, faint at first, warned of a distant eruption. Winds carried fine dust that settled on fields, clogging irrigation channels and smothering seedlings. Temperature shifts could occur rapidly, with frost appearing when warmth was expected, delaying planting or killing young crops. These sensory cues were essential for survival, guiding human responses to environmental stress in real time. Communities that could read and react to these signals survived, while others faced devastation. Volcanic eruptions also influenced long-term planning. Granaries were stocked more heavily, irrigation channels were reinforced, and trade networks were strengthened to provide food from distant regions. Societies that had learned to observe and adapt to regular climate patterns found their strategies tested by abrupt volcanic cooling. Some populations moved to higher or lower elevations in search of stable temperatures. Others adjusted planting calendars, experimented with different crop varieties, or focused on species more resilient to cold and poor light. These adaptations highlight the intersection of human ingenuity and environmental necessity, a theme that repeats throughout prehistory. Evidence from ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica shows eruptions that likely affected multiple civilizations simultaneously. Sulfate deposits in the ice correspond with narrow tree rings and reductions in agricultural pollen worldwide. These data suggest that major eruptions could produce global climate anomalies, not just local disturbances. Rainfall patterns shifted, monsoon systems weakened or intensified, and droughts followed in unexpected regions. Early civilizations, dependent on predictable seasons, were particularly vulnerable. Even modest cooling could shorten growing seasons enough to strain food reserves, force relocation, or spark conflict over scarce resources. Volcanic ash left a tactile mark on the land. Fields became coated with fine grey dust, sometimes centimeters deep, impeding plant growth. Water sources turned cloudy or acidic, harming fish and livestock. Roads, paths, and canals became clogged, requiring labor-intensive clearing. The weight of ash could collapse structures, while winds carried particles far from the eruption site. people living hundreds of kilometers away could experience grey skies, cooler temperatures, and dusty winds. Such sensory experiences were reminders that climate was not only a slow force, but also capable of sudden, violent expression. In some societies, these events were recorded through ritual or oral history. Offerings and ceremonies were designed to appease the forces believed to control the sky, rivers, and soil. Communities learned to link unusual environmental events to human actions, interpreting eruptions, storms, or sudden frost as signals that required response. While not scientific in the modern sense, these cultural practices reinforced the observation of environmental change and prepared communities to respond with labor, redistribution, or migration. The combination of sensory awareness and organized action allowed survival despite extreme climate shocks. Volcanic eruptions illustrate the fragility of early agricultural systems. Even with irrigation, storage, and trade, societies faced limits. A single event could reduce sunlight, delay spring warmth, and disrupt rainfall patterns. Grain would fail to mature, animals would struggle, and water levels would shift unpredictably. Social structures were tested as leaders attempted to allocate resources and maintain order. Where systems were flexible, populations endured. Where rigidity prevailed, collapse could follow. The geological record combined with archaeological evidence paints a clear picture. Abrupt climate events, like volcanic eruptions, were powerful agents shaping human history long before modern observation or prediction existed. Across continents, these eruptions connected natural and human systems. Ash from a distant volcano could alter monsoons in Asia, dry fields in the Middle East, and cool waters in Europe. Tree rings in multiple regions often record the same years of stress. Pollen patterns show simultaneous declines in cultivated grains. Ice cores trap gases and ash that document global dispersal. These interconnected effects demonstrate that no society was entirely isolated from planetary forces. Awareness of the environment, both immediate and cumulative, became crucial. Sensory observation, infrastructure, and societal coordination all evolved in response to the challenge of sudden climate shifts. Volcanic events served as lessons for early civilizations. They showed that stability was never guaranteed, that reliance on predictable seasons carried inherent risk. Granaries, canals, and storage systems were not just conveniences but essential buffers against sudden cooling. Trade and migration networks were not merely economic, they were survival mechanisms. The muted sunlight, ash-laden winds, and unexpected frosts forced humans to adapt quickly, reinforcing knowledge about environmental monitoring, resource management, and communal labor. In this way, volcanic eruptions became a critical factor in shaping the evolution of societies, linking geology and human history through tangible, observable effects. Even in periods of calm between eruptions, the memory of past events influenced human behavior. Farmers planned for possible short-term cooling, storing surplus grains, adjusting planting times, and diversifying crops. Communities reinforced infrastructure, dug new channels, and ensured that water could be redirected in case of disaster. Observation remained the most important tool, noting cloud patterns, changes in river flow, the smell of sulfur in the wind, and the arrival of ash particles all guided preparation and response. These lessons carried forward, shaping administrative structures, cultural practices, and survival strategies. Volcanic eruptions, sudden as they were, left long-lasting imprints on both landscapes and societies, emphasizing the intricate connection between natural forces and human resilience. Throughout history, the pattern repeats. Geological evidence shows that eruptions of varying scale caused rapid climate change, cooling summers, reducing precipitation, and creating years of stress. Societies that survived combined observation, planning, infrastructure, and social cooperation. Those that failed often faced food shortages, migration, or decline. The sensory reality of ash, muted sunlight, dust-filled winds, and cold snaps was inseparable from the political and economic consequences that followed. These events serve as vivid reminders that Earth systems are both powerful and unpredictable, and that human survival depends on careful observation, adaptation, and foresight. By the 12th century BCE, civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean had reached remarkable complexity. Palaces rose on fortified hills, cities sprawled across fertile valleys, and trade networks connected distant regions with goods, ideas, and culture. Yet beneath this apparent stability, the climate had begun to shift. Paleoclimate evidence shows a series of droughts spanning decades, reducing rainfall and lowering river levels. Sediment layers and pollen records indicate that previously reliable agricultural lands became parched. Crops failed, pastures dried, and wells ran low. The environment, which had once allowed the rise of powerful kingdoms, now pressed unrelentingly on human systems. Mesopotamian regions experienced particular strain. Tree ring studies reveal years of below-average growth in forests, reflecting diminished rainfall. Lakes shrank, their sediments becoming compacted and pale, indicating prolonged dry conditions. In some cities, granaries and irrigation canals were strained beyond capacity. Archaeological layers show abandoned fields and eroded terraces, evidence that the land could no longer sustain the populations that had once thrived there. Without reliable harvests, communities faced scarcity, and people were forced to migrate in search of water and fertile soil. These movements often carried them into conflict with neighbors, creating social tension and reshaping settlement patterns. In the Levant, fortifications and walls tell a story of both preparation and desperation. Cities reinforced their defenses not only against human rivals, but also against the chaos that famine and migration could bring. Excavations of sites such as Ugarit and Megiddo reveal layers of destruction, abandoned dwellings, and hastily burned structures. Mass graves suggest sudden mortality events, likely linked to starvation, disease, and conflict. Archaeologists note that while warfare played a role, environmental stress amplified vulnerability. Without sufficient food and water, even strong political systems struggled to maintain order and protect their populations. Egypt was not immune. The Nile's predictable inundations, the lifeblood of the land, faltered during certain decades. Granaries show evidence of emergency redistribution, and administrative records describe unusual tax relief or rationing measures. Farmers faced shrinking yields, and settlements in Upper Egypt sometimes saw temporary depopulation as people moved to more viable lands. The physical signs of stress are clear: cracked mud walls, dry canals, and eroded field terraces. Dust from dried riverbeds carried across villages, blanketing roofs and streets, creating a visual and tactile reminder of scarcity. Heat waves pressed upon the land, making labor in the fields exhausting and risky, and water scarcity transformed everyday tasks into urgent, life-sustaining chores. The Indus Valley, too, shows evidence of environmental strain. River channels shifted, leaving previously irrigated fields dry. Settlement patterns indicate that populations consolidated in areas where water remained reliable. Archaeological records suggest that some urban centers were partially abandoned, while others adapted through intensified water management and smaller-scale agriculture. Pollen evidence indicates reduced cultivation of staple grains, replaced by more drought-resistant plants. Humans responded by adjusting their settlements, reinforcing water systems, and modifying crops to survive in a changing climate. These adjustments, however, could only buffer the impact. Prolonged aridity still imposed limits on population growth and urban complexity. Climate alone does not explain the full scale of disruption. Trade networks that had connected cities across the Mediterranean began to falter. Shipwrecks, broken roads, and reduced exchange indicate that food and material scarcity reverberated through economies. In some cases, cities dependent on imported grain faced sudden shortages when distant droughts interrupted supply. At the same time, invasions and raids increased, as populations weakened by famine became easier targets. Evidence of destruction layers in coastal settlements and fortifications suggests that attacks compounded the effects of climate stress, creating a cycle in which environmental pressure amplified social and political vulnerability. Archaeological sites provide a visceral sense of these pressures. The sand that filled dried canals was coarse and hot underfoot. Heat waves shimmered above parched fields, making the air tremble and dry. Riverbeds, once teeming with water, were cracked and sun-baked. Storage pits, once full of grain, now contained dust and fragments of spoiled seeds. Walls of cities, built to protect against human foes, offered no relief from environmental extremes. The texture of life, sand, clay, heat, and water scarcity, shaped every human action, from the timing of planting to the distribution of resources and the organization of labor. Daily survival became a negotiation with the elements, as much as with other people. Sediment cores and pollen analysis reveal cycles of drought that aligned with archaeological evidence of societal disruption. In central Anatolia, grains and seeds indicate consecutive years of poor yields. Lakes show reduced levels and increased salinity, signaling prolonged dry conditions. Cities abandoned for decades correspond to these same periods, suggesting a strong link between climate anomalies and urban decline. The physical environment, as much as human policy or warfare, dictated patterns of survival. Even communities that adapted through irrigation, storage, or crop diversification faced limits imposed by prolonged drought. Population movements were both response and consequence. Families left villages when local water sources dwindled. Entire communities migrated along rivers or to coastal regions, seeking fertile soil and reliable rainfall. These movements could create tension in regions that were previously sparsely inhabited, as new arrivals competed with established populations. Archaeological layers often show abrupt changes in material culture, reflecting the influx of new groups and the blending of traditions. Drought and scarcity thus reshaped not only landscapes, but also the social and cultural fabric of the Eastern Mediterranean. Mass graves and evidence of violence underscore the human toll. Skeletons show signs of malnutrition, disease, and trauma. In some cities, layers of burned structures and abandoned households suggest that populations faced crises they could not mitigate. While warfare and invasion contributed to collapse, the underlying environmental stress amplified vulnerabilities. Without sufficient food, weakened populations were less able to defend themselves, maintain infrastructure, or continue trade. Climate acted as both a direct and indirect driver of societal disruption, influencing mortality, migration, and urban abandonment. Human responses reveal both ingenuity and fragility. Irrigation canals were expanded, granaries stocked, and administrative records carefully maintained to anticipate shortages. Religious and ritual practices intensified, often invoking deities to ensure rainfall or fertility. Settlement planning became adaptive, with temporary relocation and consolidation into more viable regions. Trade was leveraged to supplement local production, yet these measures had limits. When droughts persisted or compounded with social stress, even the most organized systems faltered. Archaeological and paleoenvironmental evidence together indicate that climate was a decisive factor in the late Bronze Age collapse, interacting with trade, political structures, and human conflict to reshape the region irreversibly. The eastern Mediterranean landscape during these decades was textured by environmental stress. Sand filled empty channels, and wind swept across fields, carrying dust into homes and markets. Sunlight became harsh on cracked earth, highlighting the scarcity of water and the vulnerability of crops. Heat waves pressed down relentlessly, making labor exhausting and increasing the risk of dehydration and illness. Rivers that had once been lifelines slowed or disappeared, forcing humans to adapt or move. These physical realities shaped everyday life, influencing decisions from planting to defense, trade, and migration. Through these observations, scientists and archaeologists reconstruct the interplay between climate and societal collapse. Tree ring data, lake sediments, and pollen records align with archaeological evidence, revealing patterns of drought, famine, and population stress. Cities were abandoned, fortifications reinforced, and communities migrated in response to environmental change. The late Bronze Age collapse illustrates a complex interplay. Climate anomalies created stress that exposed weaknesses in trade networks, political systems, and social cohesion. Human societies were capable of adaptation and resilience, yet prolonged or compounded stress could push even advanced civilizations to the brink of collapse. The Bronze Age collapse demonstrates the fragility of interlinked systems. Agricultural dependence, population density, trade reliance, and centralized administration all created efficiencies under stable conditions, but vulnerabilities under stress. Heat waves, water scarcity, and soil degradation intersected with social and political pressures. Dust-laden winds and dry riverbeds were not merely obstacles. They were immediate forces shaping labor, survival strategies, and the allocation of resources. Societies that could sense, respond, and adapt survived longer, while others were forced to disperse or dissolve. The physical reality of climate, intertwined with human networks, set the stage for profound transformation across the region. In the end, the late Bronze Age collapse is as much a story of the land and climate as it is of human decision-making. Archaeological evidence, abandoned cities, eroded fields, fortified walls, mass graves, speaks to the direct impact of prolonged environmental stress. Sediments, tree rings, and pollen records show the timing and severity of drought, revealing a natural rhythm that humans had to negotiate constantly. Observing the texture of the environment, sand, heat, cracked clay, diminished water, provides insight into the pressures experienced daily. Civilization, built upon the delicate balance of food, water, and human organization, proved vulnerable when that balance was disrupted by prolonged climate anomalies. After centuries of climate variability, the world entered a period of relatively warmer temperatures, now known as the medieval climate anomaly, roughly spanning the 9th to the 13th centuries CE. Across Europe, the warmth of these decades extended growing seasons and allowed crops to mature more fully. Fields, once marginal for cultivation, became productive, and forests receded slightly as people expanded settlements into newly arable lands. River valleys swelled with regular flow from melted snow, providing water for irrigation and fertile sediment for soil enrichment. The sensory world of human activity reflected this abundance. Long, bright summers illuminated fields of wheat and barley. River currents carried the scent of silt and greenery, and winds shifted predictably, signaling planting and harvest times. These environmental conditions created opportunities for population growth and social development that had been impossible in cooler centuries. The warmth of the North Atlantic enabled the Norse to push further west. Settlements emerged along the coasts of Iceland, and eventually, Greenland saw Norse colonization. Archaeological evidence shows that these communities relied on both farming and livestock, though the environment remained challenging. Ice cores from Greenland reveal moderate snowfall and relatively thin summer melting layers, indicating a climate that was milder than the preceding centuries. Sea ice retreated seasonally, allowing navigation and trade between islands. The Norse carefully observed their environment, timing planting and grazing according to subtle cues in temperature, wind direction, and daylight length. Winter shelters were reinforced, and storage pits were dug to preserve crops and meat through the cold months, reflecting a direct engagement with climate patterns. In continental Europe, paleoclimate reconstructions from tree rings and sediment layers corroborate historical records of extended warmth. Rings are wider, showing favorable growing conditions, and sediments indicate more stable river flows. Monasteries, which kept detailed records, note abundant harvests, while charters and tax records suggest that surplus grain supported urban expansion and trade. The warm conditions allowed cultivation of vineyards in regions previously too cold, the growth of fruit orchards, and the diversification of staple crops. Villages expanded into hillsides and floodplains, following soils enriched by annual river overflows. The sensory experience of these landscapes is striking. The warmth on the skin, the rustling of tall stalks in steady breezes, and the sounds of flowing water carrying both nutrients and life to the land. The effects of the medieval climate anomaly extended beyond Europe. In Asia, shifts in monsoon patterns influenced rice cultivation in India, China, and Southeast Asia. Stronger, more predictable rains enhanced yields, while changes in timing required farmers to adjust planting calendars. Irrigation systems were maintained with renewed attention, and techniques for water management, such as small dams, canals, and terracing, became more sophisticated. Sediment cores from river valleys show evidence of sustained agricultural activity, and pollen analysis reflects the expansion of both rice paddies and dryland crops. Villages along monsoon-fed rivers adapted to these flows, coordinating labor for planting and harvesting based on rainfall cues and water levels, demonstrating a direct observational response to environmental change. Societal innovation flourished during this period. European communities refined crop rotation practices, alternating grains and legumes to maintain soil fertility. Simple tools improved efficiency. Plows were enhanced for deeper tillage, sickles for faster harvest, and mills for grain processing. Urban centers developed more consistent water management systems, drawing on aqueducts, wells, and drainage channels. Villagers became adept at reading their environment. The temperature of the soil, the strength and direction of the wind, the clarity of river water, and the appearance of clouds all informed agricultural decisions. Sensory knowledge merged with practical innovation, allowing populations to take advantage of favorable climate conditions in ways that maximize productivity and minimized risk. River flows became a central rhythm in daily life. In regions of Europe with abundant water, farmers constructed canals to redirect currents to fields, while downstream communities relied on steady flow for mills and transport. Sediments deposited by rivers enhance soil fertility, while periodic floods renewed nutrients. The sound of water moving across stones and channels became part of the landscape's sensory fabric, signaling the onset of irrigation cycles and planting periods. In warmer months, long days allowed extended work outdoors, the sun heating stone and soil alike. Winds carried seeds, pollens, and the scent of ripening crops, providing subtle indicators of plant health and seasonal timing. Historical records from monasteries' tax rolls and chronicles provide evidence of these patterns. Years of abundant harvests are noted repeatedly, alongside reports of river flooding and mild winters. These sources complement paleoclimate data, offering a human perspective on the consequences of prolonged warmth. Villages expanded into previously marginal areas. Forests were cleared for agriculture, and cities grew in size and complexity. Trade networks benefited from surplus production, moving grain, timber, and other goods across long distances. The combination of favorable climate, human observation, and practical adaptation allowed unprecedented social expansion. In Asia, the warming and monsoon shifts facilitated rice cultivation at higher elevations and in previously unreliable regions. Terraced fields captured rainwater efficiently, reducing erosion and maintaining soil fertility. Communities adapted planting schedules according to subtle environmental cues. Early morning fogs, the sound of falling rain, and changes in wind direction all provided information for managing labor and irrigation. These practices show a deep sensory understanding of climate, integrating observation with agricultural innovation. Farmers diversified crops to reduce risk and coordinated communal labor to maintain irrigation infrastructure, ensuring resilience even in the face of occasional anomalies. The medieval climate anomaly also influenced pastoral systems. Livestock thrived with longer growing seasons and richer pastures, while herders adapted grazing patterns to seasonal flows of grass and water. Observation of animal behavior provided additional cues about climate. Movement patterns, feeding behavior, and signs of stress indicated soil moisture, temperature, and forage availability. These human-animal environment interactions were part of a complex network of observation, adaptation, and survival. Winter shelters, fodder storage, and seasonal migrations were all informed by careful reading of the land, rivers, and wind. Daily life was intertwined with the sensory landscape of climate. Long, warm days allowed extended work and social activity outdoors. River currents carried the smell of wet silt and growing vegetation. Winds brought clouds that promised rain or signaled the approach of drought. The ground was softer for ploughing and planting. Fields glowed with ripening crops, and irrigation canals reflected sunlight. Humans responded continually to these cues, coordinating work, storage, and trade. Sensory observation and practical adaptation were inseparable, shaping both individual decisions and communal strategies for survival. Population growth and urban expansion followed these environmental opportunities. Towns developed in fertile valleys, often along rivers or near coastal plains. Infrastructure expanded to manage water and soil effectively. Mills harnessed river power. Aqueducts transported fresh water, and levees protected fields from occasional floods. Agricultural surplus supported craft specialization, trade, and cultural activity. The sensory environment, long sunlight hours, flowing water, warm winds, and fertile soil enabled these expansions by providing predictable resources and opportunities for human innovation. Ice cores, sediment layers, and historical records together confirm the widespread nature of these climate conditions. The warmth and stability allowed agriculture to flourish across Europe, Asia, and the North Atlantic. Rivers maintained flow, forests receded slightly, and soils were replenished with sediment. Extended growing seasons encouraged experimentation with new crops, tools, and irrigation techniques. Communities that observed, adapted, and managed these conditions effectively expanded in population and social complexity. Sensory knowledge, temperature, sunlight, river flow, and wind remained at the center of these strategies, guiding both immediate decisions and long-term planning. This period illustrates the interplay of climate and human agency. Warmer temperatures created opportunities, but humans had to recognize and act upon them. Observation, innovation, and adaptation allowed populations to expand, improve agriculture, and develop infrastructure. Crops and livestock thrived, rivers and soils were managed effectively, and trade networks grew to link distant regions. Daily life was infused with awareness of climate. The feel of soil, the smell of rivers, the direction of the wind, and the warmth of the sun guided labor, storage, and planning. Human expansion during the medieval climate anomaly demonstrates that climate provides possibilities, but human response determines the extent to which those possibilities are realized. By the 13th century, these patterns of warmth, abundant rivers, and long summers had created a world of expanding human presence. Fields, towns, and cities grew across Europe and Asia, linked by rivers, roads, and trade networks. Communities practiced careful observation of climate signals and adapted their agriculture, water management, and social organization accordingly. The sensory environment, bright sunlight, flowing rivers, fertile soil, and steady winds, shaped daily life and guided practical decisions. The medieval climate anomaly shows how favorable climate conditions, combined with human adaptation, enabled expansion, innovation, and the spread of civilization across diverse regions. By the early 14th century, the world entered a prolonged period of cooling known as the Little Ice Age, lasting roughly until the mid-19th century. Across Europe, Asia, and the Arctic, temperatures fell, rivers froze more often, and winters lengthened. The rhythm of the seasons shifted, shortening growing periods and reducing the reliability of harvests. Fields that once produced abundant grain yielded less, and pastures grew sparse. Famines became more frequent, striking regions that had previously sustained stable populations. Diaries, municipal records, and artistic depictions from the time capture the stark reality. Snow-blanketed towns, frost-attacked crops, and bitter winds swept through villages, making survival a daily challenge. In Europe, a series of famines during the 14th century highlights the direct connection between climate and human hardship. Crops failed repeatedly, leaving populations dependent on stored grain and trade. Rivers that had once carried boats to market froze over, disrupting transport and commerce. Ice cores and tree rings reveal that these years were exceptionally cold, with narrow growth rings in forests and thick layers of ice in mountain glaciers. Communities responded with a mix of adaptation and desperation, storing grain where possible, rationing food, and sometimes migrating in search of more productive land. Paintings from this period depict frozen landscapes, heavy snows, and people struggling with the cold, offering a visual record of the environmental stress. The cooler temperatures also affected Asia. Monsoon patterns shifted, reducing rainfall in regions dependent on seasonal flooding for rice cultivation. Crops suffered, leading to local famine and population movements. Pollen and sediment records indicate reduced agricultural production, with fields lying fallow more often. Villages relied on sophisticated water management, such as terracing, canal maintenance, and reservoir use, to compensate for variable rainfall. Yet even these strategies could only partially offset the effects of the prolonged cold and shorter growing seasons. Social stress increased as communities faced repeated food shortages, sometimes coinciding with disease outbreaks that further weakened populations. In the Arctic and subarctic regions, Inuit and other indigenous communities adapted to the extended cold with remarkable ingenuity. Sea ice expanded, altering hunting routes and the availability of marine mammals. Settlements were organized to optimize access to resources, with winter shelters insulated against prolonged frost and wind. Observations of ice thickness, snow accumulation, and the behavior of animals guided subsistence strategies. Kayaks, sleds, and clothing evolved to meet the challenges of harsher winters. Sensory engagement, feeling the hardness of snow, hearing the crack of ice, noting the smell of the sea under freezing conditions, became essential knowledge for survival. These communities exemplify the human capacity to adapt to extended cooling, relying on environmental observation and flexible strategies. The Little Ice Age left clear marks on landscapes and rivers. Alpine glaciers advanced, slowly moving down valleys and altering water sources. Rivers that had previously remained open through winter froze, blocking transport and affecting trade. Floodplains froze early, while summer thaws became unpredictable, disrupting planting and harvesting cycles. Fields often suffered frost damage late in spring or early in autumn, shortening growing periods and reducing yields. Towns recorded these environmental changes meticulously, with municipal documents noting unusual ice, failed crops, and adjustments to planting schedules. Paintings from northern Europe depict harsh winters, frozen canals, snow-covered roofs, and villagers braving bitter winds. Agricultural practices shifted in response to these stresses. Farmers diversified crops to include more cold-tolerant species, rotated fields to maintain soil fertility, and reinforced storage facilities to protect grain from frost and damp conditions. Irrigation and drainage systems were modified to deal with waterlogged fields in wet periods and frozen ground in cold winters. Communities adjusted the timing of planting and harvest, guided by observation of soil temperature, snow cover, and river flow. These adaptations were essential to maintain subsistence, yet they could not prevent recurrent hardship. Shortened growing seasons combined with extreme winters often resulted in food shortages and increased vulnerability to disease. Disease followed the patterns of environmental stress. Malnutrition from repeated crop failures weakened populations, while cold, damp conditions facilitated the spread of respiratory and gastrointestinal illnesses. Records from Europe and Asia describe outbreaks coinciding with years of poor harvests. Communities experience compounded stress, scarcity of food, vulnerability to disease, and social tension. Migration and local conflict sometimes followed, as people moved in search of resources. Evidence of abandoned villages and shifting settlement patterns reflects the broader impact of the Little Ice Age on human society. The environment shaped not only physical survival, but also social organization, trade, and cultural practices. Sensory experience defined daily life during this cooling period. Snow-covered landscapes created a monochrome world, with the crunch of frost underfoot and the chill of wind cutting through layered clothing. Crops, covered in frost or stunted by cold, released earthy, damp smells as they decayed or were harvested. Ice in rivers and lakes altered soundscapes, with cracking ice and rushing meltwater signaling changing conditions. People became acutely aware of weather cues, cloud formations, wind direction, the feel of soil, and ice thickness. These observations guided decisions about planting, travel, and resource use, illustrating the intimate connection between human activity and climate. Ice expansion in northern latitudes reshaped trade and travel. Frozen rivers allowed sleds to transport goods over frozen surfaces, but also blocked traditional shipping routes. Mountain passes became hazardous due to snow and ice, altering patterns of movement and commerce. Coastal communities faced increased sea, ice, limiting access to marine resources and altering subsistence strategies. The physicality of these changes, thick ice, snow-laden landscapes, and relentless cold, shaped not only survival tactics, but also cultural expression. Festivals, rituals, and daily routines adapted to the constraints imposed by the extended cold, integrating climate awareness into the social fabric. Evidence from written and visual records supports the climate reconstructions. Diaries from European villages describe early frosts, delayed planting, and the struggle to store enough food through long winters. Municipal archives note variations in river levels and agricultural yields. Paintings from the period often highlight snow-laden landscapes and frozen waterways, providing both artistic and documentary evidence of environmental stress. Archaeological findings show adaptations in construction, with thicker walls and improved insulation in homes, reflecting a direct response to colder conditions. Together, these sources offer a comprehensive view of the Little Ice Age's impact on human life. Migration became a recurring theme in response to the cooling. Communities left marginal lands where crops failed repeatedly, moving to lower elevations or regions with milder microclimates. Archaeological layers show new settlements in previously underpopulated areas, often corresponding with periods of extreme cold. Social organization shifted as populations consolidated in more viable regions. Adaptation strategies included diversification of resources, cooperative labor for irrigation and snow management, and the development of storage infrastructure to buffer against unpredictable conditions. The physical and environmental pressures shaped not only survival, but also the evolution of communal practices and governance. In Asia, cooler temperatures influenced rice cultivation and water management. Fields required careful irrigation to compensate for irregular rainfall and reduced monsoon strength. Sediment records show periods of decreased river flow, while pollen analysis indicates shifts from staple crops to more resilient varieties. Farmers observed soil conditions, water levels, and seasonal wind patterns, adjusting planting and harvesting accordingly. These practices highlight the reliance on sensory and empirical knowledge to navigate climate stress. Cooling trends challenged traditional agricultural schedules, prompting innovation in crop selection and irrigation techniques. Arctic and subarctic communities faced unique challenges. Sea ice expanded, affecting hunting and fishing routes, while prolonged winters increased reliance on stored resources. Inuit and other indigenous groups adjusted sled routes, timing of hunting expeditions, and the design of winter shelters. Observation of ice thickness, snow accumulation, and animal movement became crucial for survival. Sensory cues, such as the sound of cracking ice, the smell of the sea under cold winds, and visual markers of ice stability, provided essential information for daily decisions. The Little Ice Age demonstrates that climate stress shaped both material adaptations and the development of environmental knowledge across diverse regions. Shortened growing seasons had cascading effects on societies. Grain yields declined, pastures supported fewer animals, and food scarcity affected both urban and rural populations. Trade networks adjusted, moving food from surplus to deficit areas. But logistical challenges and frozen waterways limited effectiveness. Social stress intensified, with tensions rising over resources and vulnerability to disease increasing. Municipal records and diaries document years of hardship, linking environmental conditions directly to societal outcomes. Communities developed coping strategies, storage, rationing, communal labor, that reflected an acute awareness of the physical realities imposed by cooling. Daily life during the Little Ice Age was a constant negotiation with the environment. Snow, ice, frost, and bitter winds shaped work, travel, and survival. The tactile experience of frozen soil, the scent of decaying crops, and the sound of cracking ice informed daily decisions. Fields required more labor to produce food. Storage facilities demanded careful management, and movement was constrained by frozen rivers and mountain passes. Human adaptation depended on careful observation, cooperation, and flexibility. Sensory engagement with the environment was as critical as social or political organization, guiding choices in farming, trade, and settlement. Overall, the Little Ice Age illustrates the profound influence of prolonged cooling on human societies. Shortened growing seasons, frozen rivers, snow-laden landscapes, and extreme winters challenged populations across continents. Adaptation strategies included crop diversification, water management, infrastructure improvements, migration, and social coordination. Diaries, municipal records, paintings, and sediment and ice core data together provide a detailed understanding of the period. Sensory experience, touch, sight, smell, and hearing shaped daily life and informed responses to environmental stress, embedding climate deeply into cultural and material practices. The Little Ice Age was not just a climatic episode but a transformative period that reshaped the rhythms of human life, survival strategies, and social organization across the world. The oceans have long acted as the planet's heartbeat, moving heat, moisture, and energy across the globe in a slow but relentless rhythm. Ancient circulation patterns shaped climate over centuries, guiding rainfall, storms, and seasonal variability. In tropical regions, the periodic warming and cooling of surface waters, known today as El Niño and La Niña events, created oscillations in weather that communities learned to observe and respond to. Coral cores, sediment layers, and isotopic analyses reveal that these cycles were not isolated events, but part of a larger system linking oceans, atmosphere, and human societies. Shifts in sea surface temperatures affected monsoon intensity, hurricane frequency, and rainfall distribution, influencing agricultural productivity and settlement patterns for entire regions. Coral skeletons, layered over decades, record subtle changes in water temperature and salinity. Each layer, marked by chemical ratios of oxygen isotopes, encodes a year's climate history. Scientists reading these cores can detect periods of ocean warming, cooling, or shifts in currents that would have influenced rainfall and river flow on land. Sediment layers from coastal deltas show similar records. Grain size and composition indicate periods of heavy flooding, strong storms, or slower deposition during drought. These natural archives demonstrate that oceanic behavior directly influenced terrestrial conditions, guiding human activity, settlement, and survival over long spans of time. The Indian Ocean, the Pacific, and the Atlantic Each carried distinct but interconnected currents. Changes in temperature or salinity in one region often propagated across the globe, altering winds, monsoon patterns, and storm tracks. In Asia, monsoon variability dictated the timing and success of rice harvests. Coral records from the Western Pacific show periods when monsoons were stronger or weaker, corresponding to wetter or drier years. Farmers responded by adjusting planting schedules, managing irrigation systems, and storing surplus grain to buffer against variability. River deltas swelled or receded, and the physical landscape of fertile plains shifted with the ebb and flow of sediment carried by changing currents. Storms emerging from oceanic variability could be sudden and violent. Coastal settlements faced hurricanes, typhoons, or cyclones, sometimes with little warning. The roar of waves, the pressure of rising tides, and the smell of salt carried inland all signaled imminent danger. Coral and sediment records capture these events as layers of broken fragments and coarse deposits, showing that the physical force of storms reshaped coastlines, eroded riverbanks, and altered estuaries. Communities rebuilt, relocated, or adapted their architecture and infrastructure in response, learning to anticipate the effects of ocean-driven weather and tides. The interplay of ocean and land became a persistent, observable reality. Shifts in ocean heat content had cascading consequences for climate. Warm currents could elevate atmospheric temperatures, enhancing evaporation and rainfall in some regions, while cold currents suppressed rainfall elsewhere. Atmospheric pressure systems responded to these shifts, altering wind patterns that affected storms, monsoons, and droughts. In the Mediterranean, Atlantic water temperatures influenced seasonal rainfall, while Pacific variability affected Asian rice production and South American river levels. These cascading effects illustrate that human societies were enmeshed within a global oceanic system, dependent on patterns that could change over years or decades, and that adaptation required careful observation and memory of prior cycles. River deltas and coastal plains were particularly sensitive to these changes. Increased rainfall, driven by oceanic warming, could swell rivers, depositing sediment and creating fertile floodplains. Conversely, reduced rainfall or altered currents could starve rivers, leaving channels shallow and exposing soils to erosion and salinity intrusion. Communities settled in these areas had to navigate the balance, choosing when to plant, where to build, and how to manage water for drinking, irrigation, and transportation. The roar of high rivers, the scent of damp earth, and the sight of shifting sandbars provided constant sensory feedback, guiding human adaptation to the rhythms of ocean and climate. Coral and sediment evidence also reveals centuries-long anomalies. Prolonged periods of warm ocean surfaces altered rainfall patterns for decades, while cold anomalies reduced storm activity in some areas, but intensified monsoon failures elsewhere. Isotopic analysis demonstrates that these variations influence temperature, salinity, and ocean density, in turn affecting global circulation. For societies dependent on reliable monsoons or river flows, such shifts could spell years of famine or forced migration. The physical impact was evident in riverbeds that shifted, deltas that expanded or contracted, and coastlines eroded by repeated storm events. Daily life was inseparable from these ocean-driven patterns. Fisheries, agriculture, and settlements all responded to ocean variability. Coastal communities monitored tidal flows, observing changes in fish behavior, water temperature, and the approach of storm clouds. Farmers inland depended on rivers fed by monsoon rainfall, influenced by ocean currents. Surplus harvests were stored or traded in anticipation of less predictable years. In some regions, irrigation systems were expanded to capture excess water during wet periods and conserve it during dry spells. Sensory engagement was constant, observing clouds and winds, noting water clarity and flow, feeling soil moisture, and hearing the pulse of rivers and waves. These observations allowed humans to adjust labor, resource use, and settlement strategies according to oceanic influence. Storms shaped not only human survival, but also cultural perception. Oral traditions often describe floods, hurricanes, and violent waves as expressions of natural power, embedding climate awareness into mythology, rituals, and societal rules. Coastal erosion altered physical space, forcing communities to relocate structures or create barriers against advancing seas. River deltas shifted, impacting agriculture and settlement locations. The sensory reality, the roar of waves, crashing tides, shifting sands, and turbulent skies, reinforced awareness of the environment's influence and the necessity of flexible planning. Knowledge passed through observation and experience was critical to mediating the risks presented by ocean-driven climate dynamics. Global connections became evident over long timescales. Currents in one ocean basin influenced weather far across the planet. Coral cores from the Pacific correlate with sediment layers in Africa, revealing simultaneous droughts or wet periods. Tree rings and ice cores provide supporting evidence of altered temperature and rainfall patterns linked to ocean circulation. These records show that human communities, whether in Europe, Asia, or the Americas, were affected by a shared system of planetary forces. Settlement, agriculture, and trade were all shaped by the ocean's slow but powerful movement, and humans responded through observation, innovation, and adaptation. The interplay of temperature, salinity, and atmospheric pressure created feedback loops with tangible effects. Warm, salty water sinking in the North Atlantic altered currents, modifying monsoon strength in Asia. Changes in ocean temperature influenced storm frequency and intensity in tropical regions. Coastal erosion and river sedimentation recorded the physical consequences. Communities felt these shifts directly. Floodwaters reached further into agricultural land, storms damaged infrastructure, and water supply fluctuated with changing river flows. Human responses involved reinforcing levees, constructing canals, relocating settlements, and adjusting agricultural calendars. Sensory engagement guided these adaptations. Listening to river currents, observing tides, and feeling the temperature of water and air. Over centuries, ocean-driven variability shaped migration, settlement, and resource management. Communities tracked patterns, noting cycles of warm and cold, wet and dry, calm and storm. Sediment layers show deposition from flooding. Coral cores reveal thermal shifts. And isotopic analysis confirms periods of altered salinity. These records illustrate the depth of the ocean's influence on human life. Coastal erosion reshaped land. River deltas migrated, and storms reminded communities of the sea's power. Daily life required constant observation and adaptation, feeling river levels, noting changes in wind and tide, and predicting agricultural productivity based on subtle cues. The oceans dictated rhythm, and humans learned to read it. Even in the absence of direct storm impact, oceanic variability shaped resource availability. Rainfall patterns dictated crop choice and timing, influencing the distribution of human populations. River flow determined irrigation potential, transportation, and trade. Fisheries relied on predictable seasonal cycles, disrupted by shifts in current or temperature. Communities learned to manage uncertainty through storage, diversified agriculture, and migration strategies. sensory observation, touch, sight, sound, and smell remain central to interpreting environmental change. The roar of storms, shifting currents, and the movement of sediment provided constant, tangible feedback about the state of the environment. Ultimately, ancient oceans acted as both stabilizers and disruptors of human societies. They carried heat across the planet, driving monsoons, storms, and rainfall patterns that shaped agriculture and settlement. Coral and sediment cores, tree rings, and isotopic analysis reveal long-term variability and abrupt changes. Humans responded through careful observation, adaptive strategies, and infrastructure, translating sensory awareness into survival and societal development. Coastal erosion, shifting deltas, roaring storms, and changing river flows were not distant phenomena. They were integral to daily life, shaping food security, settlement decisions, and cultural understanding. The oceans were central to climate feedbacks that connected physical, biological, and human systems over centuries. Across the long sweep of history, scientists have pieced together the story of climate and human societies using a combination of ice cores, sediments, tree rings, and archaeological evidence. Each source provides a unique lens, recording conditions that shaped life over centuries and millennia. Ice cores from polar regions reveal layers of snowfall compressed into solid sheets, capturing atmospheric gases, volcanic ash, and isotopic ratios that indicate temperature and precipitation patterns. Sediments in lakes, river deltas, and coastal basins record floods, droughts, and periods of erosion or deposition, preserving a tangible record of environmental change. Tree rings offer precise annual resolution, showing good or poor growth depending on rainfall, temperature, and soil moisture. Archaeological sites, from ruined cities to ancient fields, display how humans responded to these conditions, revealing the interplay between environment and society. Patterns emerge when these records are compared. Droughts, cold periods, or volcanic cooling events often coincide with evidence of societal stress. Abandoned settlements, reduced trade networks, and disruptions in agriculture reflect the tangible impact of environmental stress. Conversely, periods of climate stability often align with expansion, technological innovation, and thriving populations. Humans did not experience climate passively. Careful observation, memory, and adaptation shaped survival. Farmers noted the timing of rainfall, the frost on soil, and river levels. Merchants observed ice thickness and wind patterns for navigation. Communities adjusted diets, labor allocation, and storage to buffer against extremes. These responses left traces in architecture, infrastructure, and material culture, offering scientists insight into both resilience and vulnerability. Migration stands out as a recurrent strategy. When local conditions deteriorated, populations moved to areas with more reliable water and fertile land. Archaeological layers sometimes show sudden shifts in settlement patterns, with new villages appearing in previously uninhabited regions. Migration could relieve pressure on food resources and reduce exposure to extreme climate, but it also carried social challenges, such as conflict with established populations and the need for rapid integration. Material evidence, pottery styles, housing structures, and tools can indicate the arrival of new groups, revealing adaptation through relocation and cultural exchange. Migration demonstrates a balance between necessity imposed by climate and human agency. Technological adaptation is another consistent theme. Irrigation canals, terraces, and dams were built to manage variable rainfall. Storage facilities protected grain through periods of scarcity. Crop rotation, the introduction of drought-tolerant plants, and the diversification of food sources allowed communities to maintain subsistence. In regions prone to flooding or storms, houses were elevated or reinforced. Boats and roads were adapted to shifting rivers or ice conditions. These practical measures illustrate that humans responded empirically, observing environmental cues and acting to mitigate risk. Adaptation was not random, but carefully tuned to the rhythms of local climates. Trade networks functioned as buffers against localized climate stress. Grain, timber, and other essential goods moved from surplus to deficit regions. Archaeological evidence of marketplaces, ports, and roads highlights the material infrastructure supporting this exchange. Trade allowed societies to survive periods of drought or flood, connecting communities to wider environmental knowledge. Observing river flow, wind patterns, and seasonal changes was crucial for timing trade expeditions, ensuring that goods arrived before scarcity became critical. Sensory knowledge, sight, touch, and sound of the environment guided these movements, reflecting a deep awareness of the world's interconnected systems. Social structures evolved in response to environmental pressure. Administrative systems managed granaries, water distribution, and labor allocation. Rituals and communal activities reinforced cooperation and shared memory of past environmental challenges. In some cases, centralized authorities emerged to coordinate responses to drought or flood, while in others, local governance adapted flexibly to changing conditions. Material culture, from fortified granaries to irrigation channels, embodies these social adaptations, showing the intimate connection between environmental observation and organized response. Humans interpreted subtle signals from the landscape to make decisions that balanced risk and reward, ensuring survival across generations. Scientific reconstruction combines these sources to illuminate the dynamics of human-environment interaction. Ice cores reveal temperature shifts and atmospheric composition. Sediments record river flow, soil deposition, and flood events. Tree rings provide annual resolution of drought and growth. Archaeological sites show human response to these patterns. Which crops were planted, where settlements were located, and how trade and technology supported survival. By synthesizing these records, scientists avoid speculation, focusing instead on carefully observed and measured evidence. The story that emerges is one of dynamic interplay between climate and society, where human resilience depended on awareness, innovation, and adaptation. Environmental cues shaped perception and daily life. Farmers sensed soil moisture, the appearance of clouds, and river depth. Herders observed animal behavior for indications of forage and weather. Fishers gauged tidal patterns and water clarity. Winds carried the smell of rain or drying earth, while the sound of rivers and streams signaled seasonal changes. Over centuries, these sensory observations informed decisions about planting, migration, construction, and storage. Humans were continuously engaged with their environment, reading signs that could mean survival or hardship. Landscapes changed slowly but perceptibly, shaping human awareness and behavior over time. Long-term changes reveal both vulnerability and opportunity. Societies that failed to respond to prolonged droughts, cooling events, or flooding experienced decline, abandonment, or collapse. Communities that adapted through irrigation, storage, crop diversification, migration, and social coordination maintained stability and sometimes flourished. Archaeological evidence shows repeated cycles of success and stress, illustrating that human response is as important as the environmental event itself. Climate acts as a driver, but human observation, knowledge, and action mediate its consequences. The evidence underscores the necessity of empirical awareness and adaptive capacity for survival over long timescales. The landscapes themselves provide context. River deltas shifted gradually, marshes expanded or dried, and forest boundaries moved in response to climate. Soil color, texture, and moisture recorded past conditions, while sediment layers marked floods and erosion. Ice sheets, glaciers, and mountain snowpacks reflected temperature variability, influencing rivers and regional weather patterns. Human perception incorporated these changes. Subtle shifts in vegetation, seasonal water levels, and soil quality guided planting, building, and resource management. Sensory experience was both practical and formative, shaping not just daily life but cultural knowledge passed across generations. Patterns of adaptation were regionally specific yet globally resonant. In Europe, irrigation canals, crop rotation, and storage facilities mitigated droughts and shortened growing seasons. In Asia, terraces and flood management allowed rice cultivation to persist under variable monsoons. In the Arctic, hunting, shelter, and navigation were tuned to ice extent and seasonal wind patterns. Trade and migration connected distant regions, providing access to resources when local environments failed. Archaeological and paleoclimate records demonstrate that adaptation required continuous observation, knowledge transfer, and flexible management, highlighting the enduring importance of empirical engagement with the environment. The sensory and atmospheric dimension of these changes emphasizes that climate was not abstract, but experienced physically and socially. Snow accumulation, floodwaters, wind, soil moisture, and temperature shifts shaped every action. Planting, travel, storage, construction, and social coordination. The smell of wet earth after rainfall, the feel of frost on crops, the sound of a swollen river, all conveyed information critical to survival. These cues were observed, remembered, and acted upon. Across centuries, human societies developed sophisticated responses to environmental variability, showing that resilience relied on both material adaptation and perceptive engagement with the climate system. In synthesizing evidence from ice cores, sediments, tree rings, and archaeological sites, the story of human-climate interaction comes into focus. Societies were shaped by environmental challenges, yet they were not passive. Migration, technology, trade, and social structures reflect empirical responses to changing conditions. Observational skills, transmitted knowledge, and cultural adaptation allowed communities to survive in the face of stress. Landscapes evolved slowly, carrying subtle signals that humans learned to interpret. Climate events influenced the timing of planting, settlement patterns, and the organization of labor, and over centuries, these adaptations became embedded in both material culture and social practice. The evidence emphasizes careful reconstruction rather than speculation. By observing the physical record, layered ice, compacted sediment, tree rings, and the remains of settlements, scientists can trace how climate variability influenced human resilience or vulnerability. Human adaptation is observable in irrigation channels, storage facilities, architectural modifications, and settlement shifts. The interplay between environment and society emerges not from conjecture, but from measurable traces of past conditions and responses. Sensory experience, sight, touch, sound, and smell played a central role in decision-making, linking observation with survival strategies. Ultimately, the lessons from paleoclimate and archaeology reveal the delicate balance between human systems and environmental conditions. Long-term climate variability shaped food production, settlement patterns, social organization, and technological innovation. Humans developed strategies to navigate uncertainty, relying on observation, memory, and experimentation. Landscapes change slowly, subtly conveying cues about rainfall, temperature, and river flow. By synthesizing physical, evidence, and archaeological data, we understand how societies responded to challenges, showing that resilience arises from careful attention to the environment, practical adaptation, and the ability to anticipate and respond to change. The sensory world, the feel of soil, the sound of rivers, the sight of shifting landscapes, remained inseparable from the development of human knowledge and societal continuity. Looking back across thousands of years, the record of climate and human societies reveals patterns that remain relevant today. Ancient shifts in rainfall, temperature, and storm frequency shaped agriculture, settlement, and social organization in ways that modern scientists can measure and understand. Ice cores, tree rings, sediment layers, and archaeological sites provide evidence not only of what happened, but of how humans observed, responded, and sometimes failed to respond. Recognizing these patterns allows contemporary science to frame the risks associated with rapid climate change, linking the past to the present through continuous observation and analysis. In the historical record, periods of drought, cold snaps, or unusual flooding often triggered food shortages and social stress. Entire regions experienced migration, trade disruption, or settlement abandonment as a direct consequence of environmental change. Modern climate science observes similar potential risks, though on a global scale and accelerated by industrial activity. By comparing the past to present conditions, researchers can identify vulnerabilities in agriculture, water resources, and human infrastructure. Understanding how societies adapted or collapsed provides insight into what strategies may sustain or protect populations today. Human observation remains a constant thread. Ancient farmers, herders, and fishers paid attention to clouds, winds, rivers, soil moisture, and the behavior of animals. These sensory cues guided decisions in planting, harvesting, building, and migration. Today, scientific instruments expand this observation to include satellites, ocean buoys, and climate models, yet the principle is similar. Attentive monitoring informs response. The continuity of this practice underscores that human societies have always relied on understanding environmental signals to survive and thrive. The integration of observation and action forms the foundation of both past resilience and modern preparedness. Earth functions as an interconnected system, where oceans, atmosphere, rivers, and land interact in complex feedbacks. Historical examples demonstrate that shifts in one component often affected distant regions. A drought in one basin could cascade into famine, migration, and social upheaval elsewhere. Modern science recognizes this networked sensitivity, using paleoclimate data to validate models of circulation, monsoon patterns, and ocean-atmosphere interactions. Observing these connections reinforces the idea that the planet is an integrated system, where local events can have global consequences. Ancient records are thus not mere history. They are lessons in systemic thinking. Reflecting on these patterns, the landscapes themselves speak of continuity. River deltas, mountain glaciers, forests, and coastal plains have all borne witness to environmental change. The subtle smell of wet earth, the sound of flowing water, and the sight of shifting sands carried messages for humans, just as they continue to do. Observing these signs allowed communities to adapt, innovate, and survive. Today, scientists listen to the Earth's signals in new ways, but the principle remains the same. Careful attention, combined with action, provides understanding and security. The story of climate and human adaptation is both ancient and ongoing. Ultimately, connecting ancient shifts to modern awareness emphasizes the importance of learning from the past. Recognizing how rainfall patterns, temperature fluctuations, and storms influenced human life centuries ago guides contemporary responses to climate stress. By studying evidence preserved in ice, soil, trees, and ruins, we gain a perspective on resilience, vulnerability, and the capacity for adaptation. These lessons are embedded in the sensory and material world, in the texture of soil, the flow of rivers, and the movement of glaciers. Observing and understanding these signals remains as vital now as it was for our ancestors. As the planet continues to change, the message from the past is clear. Humans live within a sensitive network of environmental systems. Ancient societies adapted through observation, innovation, and cooperation. Their successes and failures offer guidance for navigating modern climate challenges. Understanding the continuity of human experience with climate reminds us that observation, adaptation, and respect for natural processes are enduring strategies. Landscapes, rivers, oceans, and skies all provide cues, the lessons of centuries past. Encourage attentive engagement with these signals today. The final reflection draws together the story of climate and human society. From ancient droughts to the Little Ice Age, from ocean currents to volcanic cooling, the Earth's systems have shaped human life in observable, measurable ways. By studying the material and sensory records left behind, we see patterns of response, resilience, and innovation. These lessons remind us that climate is not abstract. It is experienced directly, shaping daily life, societal organization, and survival. Contemporary science builds on this long tradition, interpreting signals with new tools, but relying on the same principle: careful observation and thoughtful response to a dynamic and interconnected world. In this quiet awareness, the Earth presents itself as both teacher and participant. Its oceans, rivers, mountains, and skies carry messages that echo through time. Humans have learned to read these messages, translating sensory and empirical cues into strategies that sustain life. Ancient shifts in climate are not distant stories. They are continuous threads woven into the fabric of human experience. Observing Earth as an integrated system allows us to understand the delicate balance between environmental change and human adaptation, illuminating the path forward with the clarity of evidence and the weight of experience. The landscape, the climate, and human resilience are intertwined, teaching that attentive observation, careful planning, and adaptive behavior remain essential across the ages.